Hey there, art nerds. So I am back with another favorite watercolor technique that I want to share with you guys today. I want to talk about using multicolors as toning washes. And we're going to be playing around with some really fun, bright colors today. And it's almost going to seem like we can't paint on top of them. And I'm going to show you guys how it can just bring a lot of fun and liveliness to your art and how you actually can paint on top of them. So get ready to play with a lot of wet into wet techniques today. So in general, I would recommend using professional grade watercolors for this technique, but you can do it with decent student grade watercolors. I'm using the Marie's master level watercolors, which I feel handle kind of like a student grade for this example. You guys might recognize this from my bouquet tutorial. If you're interested in that and you haven't seen it yet, check the description below. So what I'm doing is I am creating a pool of several colors that I'm going to want to use to create my wash. I went ahead and pre-wet my cotton rag watercolor paper and I really saturated it. You want to have a lot of water going on in the page. And I'm doing what I call the sun ray technique. So it's lines of color coming up at an angle. So I'm doing the whole bouquet thing that I explain later on, and I'm going to let it dry, and then I'm going to apply more layers of the same technique to kind of build up the amount of color that I'm looking for. So with these sort of multicolor, multitonal washes, one of the things you want to keep in mind is work with lighter layers first and kind of build things up from there, because it's easy to add too much color and then kind of struggle to paint on top of it. And you can paint on top of it depending on your subject matter. If you're painting flowers on top of it, you can really go super saturated, and we'll talk about that in our next example. But if you're painting people and faces in particular on top of it, you might want to leave the faces as a lighter area or an area that you've lifted out with your paper towel while it's still wet, like I'm demonstrating here, or just an area you never quite add color to, because on faces, these kind of colors can really kind of kill the skin tone, and it's less noticeable on things like hands and feet, but on faces it's really kind of a big deal. So one of my first tips, if you're doing a multicolor toning wash like this, is kind of be careful around faces. I wouldn't say use masking fluid to mask out faces necessarily. That can create a really harsh contrast between where you added your color and where you didn't. I would just kind of work around it, kind of avoid those areas as you guys see me doing here, or use your paper towel to lift them up. And this is particularly true for greens and for blues. So here is the finished watercolor illustration. I painted right on top of that wash, and what it ended up doing was just adding a nice background and adding a lot of charm to it. Here's the finished watercolor illustration. It was painted on Arches cold pressed cotton rag watercolor paper, so a paper that can handle a lot of water being thrown at it. I will link the review that I created this for down in the description below if you're interested in learning more about these watercolors. So for our next example, I'm going for a really bright and vibrant floral. So I'm going to go ahead and really saturate my paper again for this one, and I'm again working on Arches watercolor paper. I'm using My Marie blue watercolors for this one, and I am using yellows and ultramarine blues, and then I'm working in some warm and cool reds, and I'm really working with a lot of very bright, potentially saturated colors. But because we pre-saturated our paper with water, they're going to blend out and diffuse out, particularly with the My Marie blue paints. They have a beautiful diffusal wet into wet, so you can get these really soft transitions. That's another thing. If you want to do this technique and you want these softer transitions, work with a watercolor that contains oxgall. Oxgall is going to cause your watercolors to move and to travel more and to be less stodgy. This is a technique that won't work nearly as well if you have really thick or stodgy watercolor paints. Another thing is you really do want to work on a cotton rag for this, something that can take and hold a lot of water, something that you can control the dry time. Once it's wet, it's really, really wet, and something that can take all of these layers. Whether you choose to allow the layers to dry and kind of get locked in and then add more water and paint on top of that, or you're doing what I'm doing here, working kind of quickly, adding in your colors and kind of darkening them as you go, you're going to want a paper that can keep up with that. Also note that I kept the color mostly off her face even in this example. There is a little bit of migration of the ultramarine blue. That's not really a problem. It's kind of on the side of her face that would be in shadow, so I'm not really concerned about that. But even in this illustration, which is really bright and colorful and has a lot of different flowers in it, I kind of stayed away from her face because I knew that once I added color to her face, it might be really hard to work around it. You can also lift up some colors with paper towels in other areas as necessary. And you can also kind of re-wet it after it's dried and go in and add more wet into wet. So here is the finished illustration. You guys could hardly see those toning washes, but I feel like they really added a lot to the illustration. And I feel like it really kind of set the stage and set the mood for what I had in mind. Like with the last segment, if you're interested in how my Marie Blue watercolors perform, I'll have them linked for you guys down in the description. I will say though that they are a wonderful professional grade watercolor for this particular technique and should be able to keep up with it. And you can definitely paint on top of them, layer on top of them, them through their paces. They are definitely a good one for this technique, although they are a little bit expensive. So for this next example, this is a commission that I did for a friend of mine. I actually did a pair of twin commissions and I wanted something really fun and bright and kind of girly pop. So I am working with yellow and pink for the underpainting. So I want really warm and comforting vibes, but also kind of like 80s, early 90s girly going on here. This is a larger watercolor illustration. I am still working on Arches watercolor paper. It's just a bigger one. And one of the challenges of working with a larger piece of paper like this is just keeping it all wet as you're going. So you may have to spritz it down. You may have to encourage colors to blend and move more if they're not moving quite as much as you would like for them to move. And you may have to work quickly. I will point out that all of these segments have been sped up about 8x because ain't nobody got time to watch paint dry. So, you do want to work quickly, but you also want to work with a lot of water. I also have the colors that I want to add pre-mixed to make it easier to add. And here is the finished watercolor illustration for that piece. You guys can see the end result actually has a lot of warm colors, but has a lot of blues and purples in the illustration as well. And you can see a little bit of that toning wash showing through on the, it's like a sewn trivet, like a pot trivet, I guess a cotton trivet is what it would be, that they're using as a rug. You can kind of see some of those colors in the cats as well. They're not super distracting and, they're there if you're looking for them, but they do kind of add a little bit of like that charm that watercolor can bring to the table, a little bit of that color vibrancy. And that's one of the reasons I really love doing these kind of toning washes as underpainting for my illustration. It just kind of sets the mood. It kind of sets the stage and it kind of gets me excited for watercolor. It also helps break up the kind of white blankness of an inked illustration. It kind of breaks the ice for me. So this is the sister illustration to that, and for it I'm using a hot pink and an ultramarine blue, a color combo that I really love. And I'm not afraid of using ultramarine blue in this kind of instance. I really like that granulation that it brings to the table, the kind of soft dreaminess that this color has, and I really love how it looks with this kind of, it's not an opera rose, okay? It's not a fugitive color. It's, oh shoot, it's more like a magenta. It's a more stable pink, I had a really difficult time color grading this one. I do try not to use not light fast colors, particularly in commissions. I try to be really careful about it standing the test of time. I do have an opera rose. As you guys can see, I have several, but it's something I use for my own personal art, not necessarily for commissions. I will say that for an underpainting though, an opera rose, like a fugitive neon hot pink color, would look so good. It would be so fun to paint on top of. And you can see with this one a little bit more of those pinks and those blues kind of shining through. It gives kind of like a later afternoon feel, which I think is a really nice complement to the kind of sunny earlier in the day feel that the sister illustration had going on for it. I do feel like though you can see some of the toning wash, it's not as noticeable as in its sister piece. You really have to know where you're looking for, what you're looking for with this one. But like I said earlier, it does kind of help break up the blankness, the starkness of the page, especially because I ink my watercolor illustrations beforehand, and some of these illustrations take hours to ink, and they are an act of labor in and of themselves, and it can feel kind of intimidating to start that watercolor illustration on top of this thing that you just inked, that if you mess it up, you're gonna have to re-ink it and start all over again. And I find the toning wash kind of like helps ease me into it, helps get me thinking about the color palette, starts to introduce that color palette, can really help harmonize the color palette on the page. And just in general, it kind of breaks up blank page syndrome. So I'm not as intimidated by the illustration once I'm, mixing the paint and going with it. And here is the illustration freed from its confines. So some tips, again, just to reiterate: cotton rag paper, quality watercolors. So this is my daily driver palette. It's all professional grade watercolors in this palette. It's what I use when I'm painting 7-inch Cara. So these are paints that I know and I trust. You are welcome to try this out with new paints. You are welcome to try it out with paints you're not super familiar with. Another tip is prep your color washes in advance, because once you've started painting your underwashes, it's going to go really quickly. So for this, I'm using Winsor Newton's Rose Dior. It looks redder than it actually is. This is beautiful blush pink for this illustration. So it's going to be like Rose Dior, and I think then a granulating purple. And for this, I wanted kind of like a fun 80s vibe in the background. So I'm doing some splatter technique. I'm using a granulating purple. With this one, I am doing kind of a zigzag technique, and I'm leaving the center lighter because that's the focal point. That's where there's going to be a lot of colors, and I don't want to create too much muddiness. So I'm kind of using this tonal wash to create an easy background. There's a lot of wet into wet. There's a lot of striping going on. I'm trying to keep it kind of loose, and I'm working with big brushes. So that's another thing with these kind of tonal washes, is you want to work with larger brushes that can deliver a lot of paint and that can deliver a lot of water to your paper. So that's what the tonal wash looks like. Here is the finished piece. So for this one, there is a lot of color in the center, but you can still see a lot of that tonal wash background. And I was trying to kind of center the illustration, kind of keeping everything moving towards the center and drawing the eye to the center. Another helpful thing is that you can use contrasting colors to kind of pop the foreground from the background with the tonal washes. So you can use that kind of color vibrancy to make a more visually arresting image. If you want something a little calmer, you can go with toning washes that match your subject matter or complement your subject matter. You can also use it to imply a background or imply lighting or imply an emotional state or a dream state. Tonal washes and multiple tonal washes can be really useful for conveying and achieving a lot of things, whether it's a quick and easy background, or it's a way to convey an emotion, or it's a way to unify a color palette. This is a great technique that I think you guys should try out if you're feeling up to it. It's one of my favorites. It is one you guys saw me use time and time again, and I'm really glad that I could kind of break it down for you and walk you guys through my process. For pretty much all of these, I used Arches cotton rag watercolor paper. I used large mops, large quills, hockey brushes to put a lot of water on the paper. I used large salad and dinner plates to put a lot of paint on the paper. And I also used little sauce dishes from my local Asian food mart to mix up a significant amount of my initial tonal washes. And you guys can see those off to the side. So if there are any other techniques that you see me use that you're interested in me explaining or exploring for you guys, let me know down in the comments below. Tutorials like this are made possible thanks to my amazing patrons on Patreon. Thank you guys so much. I hope to see you guys again really soon. I hope this was helpful, useful, and informative, and helpful in you guys making art a habit. Have a wonderful day, guys. Bye.